Hi everybody, this is Noelle from Petitti Garden Centers, and we want to do a basil spotlight for you. And I know that basil is probably a favorite among the herbs, especially for a lot of us in this area. And of course, working for Petitti's, we use it a lot in our cooking. And it's an annual culinary herb typically, so just be aware. And it is super frost sensitive. People joke that if you walk past it with like ice cubes in your drink, that it'll start to go down. That's not necessarily true. But we're going to tell you all the different things that you need to know to be successful with your basil indoors and outside. So let's start out with the sun. So their sunlight requirements, they really are a full sun annual plant. So you're looking at 6 or more hours of direct sunlight on that plant. And if you're bringing it inside and trying to grow it as a windowsill herb, make sure you've got it in the sunniest windowsill as possible, okay? They really do need that direct sunlight to keep on going and flourishing for you. The next thing is, of course, is soil. And so with their soil, it's pretty critical that it needs to be well-drained but rich soil. Lots of times when we grow garden plants, we talk about adding all of those organic matters to the garden soil to make it more rich, and that's fine, but make sure that it is draining well. The problem here is with most basil, if they get too wet, they have a lot of disease problems. They will develop fusarium wilt, they'll develop downy mildews, and all of those great things. So needless to say, well-drained soil is the key. So lots of times we'll grow them in just a standard potting mix, Petitti potting mix, just because we can ensure that that soil is going to drain nicely for those plants. So be aware of that. Good drainage is really key here with growing basil. Another thing that you want to look at is watering. And so when you're watering basil, they do want to be averagely moist, okay, or evenly moist. They can go slightly dry, not a problem. They'll bounce back from a little bit of dryness. Don't let them go totally into drought. And the other thing is when you're watering, water them deeply. And we often talk about watering 1 inch of water 1 time per week. Thorough, deep watering is always going to be best for your plant material because that makes their root system go down into the soil. But for basil especially, they like that deep, thorough watering. So things to keep in mind. Fertilizer. Feed them. They definitely like to be fed through the growing season, of course. So we're talking April through September typically. And what you want to do is use a slow release organic food. You can use Osmocote. I prefer to use the organics on these guys, especially because you're growing them outside during the growing season. And you could use Plant Tone, you can use Garden Tone. Either one of those will do very, very nicely. If they need a quick burst of energy, if you will, you can use one of the liquid organic fertilizers out there. Espoma makes them. You could use, kelp meal and all those types of things. So do really feed them. They do appreciate some fertilizer there. Humidity. If you're growing them indoors, you do want to keep them in a higher humidity area. So you can do that in a couple of different ways. You could spray mist them daily. Always do that in the morning. That would be fine if you can do that. We like to put humidity trays underneath plants that need higher humidity. So it's a tray with pebbles, and then you fill that tray with water and you set the potted plant on top of that tray, and that water will slowly evaporate. If you have a really sunny window in the bathroom, great. You can grow basil in the bathroom again because of high humidity as we shower and things. Or in the kitchen, it's great because again, as you're boiling water or what have you, doing dishes, those types of things, you're going to give them more humidity. So that's an ideal spot, obviously, sunny window in the kitchen. Do be aware that if they are close to a window, on a windowsill, okay, that you want to make sure they're not touching that window, okay, because it can be very cold, and you'll notice right away if their foliage gets cold, it's going to go downhill. It'll turn black just like that. So do be aware of that. Try to keep them away from any cold surfaces and cold temperatures again, okay. With basil, maintenance-wise, there's a couple things that you need to do. And the first thing that we talk about with basil and many varieties produce flowers. They produce flowers fairly quickly. I was just talking to Taylor about how lime basil almost produces flowers daily. So it's one of those high maintenance basils where you're constantly deadheading that plant in order to keep the foliage very, very vigorous, push that energy down back into the plant so you get more foliage growth. And that's of course what you're consuming most of the time. Don't get me wrong, the flowers on basil are edible. You can use them in whatever you like, in salads, soups, what have you. Not a problem whatsoever. Flowers on basil are usually just a lighter flavor, that lighter scent, lighter flavor of what the leaf would provide you as far as herbs are concerned. But deadheading, making sure you're removing the flowers. You really don't want them to go to seed, because that takes a lot of energy to make sure that those flowers, you know, obviously produce seed. So make sure that you are removing them before that happens, and you're going down to basically the next top node here where there's some leaf growth. So I'm just pinching that off. I've, you know, removed that whole flower stalk, just a little bit of a few small leaves, which I could use later, no problem. And I could use these flowers if I wanted to as well, okay? So deadheading, keep that in mind, very, very important. And you could go through this entire plant. This is African blue basil. You could go through and you could pinch all of these in a matter of moments and be ready to go. And of course, that energy would be pushed down, back down into the plant, and you would get more leaf growth. And that, of course, is usually our goal when we're growing basil. So that took me, I don't know, 10 seconds or so, took all those flowers off. And now, whoop, maybe I left a few there behind. And now, hopefully, again, energy goes down to the base and starts filling out at the top again, okay? So very, very important to deadhead. The other thing that you can do with basil is you want to harvest it, and you do want to harvest as often as you need. So it depends on how much basil you're using from day to day. But when we talk about harvesting, you want to go in and harvest your herb plants in the morning, usually after the dew is gone, and go in, and you really do want to, harvest about a quarter to a third of the stems on that plant. And you think, oh my gosh, Noelle, I don't think I'm going to use that much basil for the dish or whatever that I'm going to be making that day. It's okay, because now we're going to take the rest of that and we're going to preserve it. So when you're cutting into the plant, that's again just going to make it produce more for you. So make sure that you're harvesting that. You continue to harvest your herb plants. The more you use them, the more that they will return and produce more. And Angelo talks about keeping them viable, keeping them so that they continue to produce that foliage growth, instead of moving into seed growth or what have you, seed development. You don't want to do that, okay? So continue to harvest. And so when we go in and we harvest, this is a variegated leaf basil. It's called Pesto Perpetuo. And I do really enjoy it because it's a beautiful basil plant. And it's columnar. It's a very upright growing. But again, if I'm going in and I have a whole plant right here, I'm going to take usually about a third of it off. So I'm going to take this top stem off, cut down where there's a node, and go ahead and use this. And if I need to clip a little bit more, I will, and continue. And then I'll go to the next plant that's planted there. And again, I'll take about a third of those stems off down to a node and go ahead and use that as needed. And so I've taken that top third off, and I will use this and process this as needed, and maybe make some pesto or some pasta tonight, okay? So those types of things, you want to make sure that you're harvesting, and you do want to do that in the morning. The reason being is that the plant, as it slept overnight, it closed all of its pores and it's held all of its aromatic goodness inside it. So we've got some sirens going by, so Taylor's eyes are lifting up. So needless to say, that's something that you need to remember when you are harvesting herbs. And with basil, we always talk about, the fresh leaves, the smaller leaves, which are always going to be at the tops of your stems. So as you're cut down into the plant, it'll branch, it'll produce more new growth for you, and that's great. Then that's what you're going to continue to harvest, okay? So that's a really good thing. The other thing that I wanted you to keep in mind with basil is it is really easy to propagate, and not necessarily from seed. Seed growing basil, you can collect seed, no problem, and you can grow that seed depending on what you have. But seeding basil is tricky. It's not an easy herb plant, or I should say annual plant, to grow from seed indoors in the winter months. The reason being, again, as I mentioned earlier, it can get some diseases. It can get fusarium. It can have some mildew issues. So that's why it's a little bit difficult to start from seed. But if you start from cuttings and just place this cutting, remove some of the bottom leaves, and put it in a little bud vase of water, it will actually root for you, and then you can take the rooted cutting and go ahead and plant more basil, okay? So this is a really, really easy way to do that. And even if you are not growing the basil plants and you went to the grocery store and you got one of those packages of basil, it's a stem, right? So make a fresh cut at the bottom of the stem and go ahead and just put it in some water, and you will have more basil growing, and you can pot up those rooted stems. So very, very easy to do with basil. This family is excellent as far as rooting in water, no problem whatsoever. Okay, so keep that in mind. Attributes, oh my gosh, so many different attributes with basil. It's a sacred plant in India. It's used in a lot of different foods, Thai foods, Italian foods, but we can use it on, in soups, sandwiches, sauces, salads. I mean, you can use basil in many, many different ways. And for the most part, they have sort of a licorice or an anise type aroma and taste to them. Some taste more clove in it, which is fine too. The African blue basil has more of a camphor type taste. It's very astringent. So it just kind of depends what you prefer. There are lemon basils available out there. There are spicy basils available out there that have a little bit more of a kick to them. So it just kind of depends what you prefer when you're cooking. And lemon basil, I forgot, with the lemon basils, you can use that in more dessert type dishes. So you could do fruit salad with lemon basil. You can do obviously beverages and things with lemon basil. So it's all good. It just depends on what you prefer. I kind of forgot something when we were talking about harvesting, and that was the processing part of your herbs. When you go after you're harvesting, if you're not using everything as a fresh herb later that day in dishes and so forth, what do you do with basil? And honestly, the easiest way to preserve basil is by chopping it or using it the way that you normally do. So if you like a whole leaf, no problem, you can do this with a whole leaf. Or if you like chopping it and making it in finer pieces, that's fine too. But the easiest way to store it literally is taking those whole leaves or the chopped leaves and putting them in ice cube trays and packing them in an ice cube tray. And then you can actually pour water or olive oil over those leaves, and then you go ahead and freeze those ice cubes. And then you can pop them out later because maybe you want regular ice cubes, and that's fine. So you pop them out and you can put those basil cubes in a baggie or what have you and keep them in the freezer. And then when you're ready to make your soups, your sauces, your stews, curries even, you can go ahead and just pop the basil right into those hot dishes and you're ready to go. You've added your basil. So that's really the easiest way to store basil. on the long run. I've also known plenty of people will dry basil, not a problem whatsoever. So you can microwave dry or you can oven dry basil. It all works out. Microwave, you want to use a defrost setting, put it between 2 dry paper towels. The paper towels will start to absorb moisture, and then just kind of run the defrost setting at small increments. So let's say you start with 30 seconds, and then you could go a little bit more. Just keep on adding time as you need to get them dry and crumbly. Same thing with oven. If you can put your oven setting on the lowest setting as possible, spread them across like a cookie pan, basically a cookie sheet, then go ahead and just spread those leaves across. And again, just check on them every once in a while to the point where they get drier, they can crumble for you, obviously not get burnt. Okay, so a lot of checking when you're processing those. One other way that I found that basil works really, really nicely for a shorter period of time is if you want to take your basil leaves, and you can take a small glass jar with a tight fitting lid, and you can go ahead and pack your basil leaves into the jar, make a layer, and then just sprinkle it with salt, make another layer, sprinkle it with salt, make another layer, sprinkle it with salt. And when you've packed that jar full, so it could be a small like baby food type jar, you can pack those and then add olive oil over the top, put the lid on, put it in the refrigerator. It'll last for about a week to 10 days, and you're ready to go. You could use that basil, and it preserves fairly well that way. But again, just a short period of time. You'll need to use it, faster than you would if you process them and put them in ice cubes. Okay, so that was a lot for processing with basil. Other attributes: basil can actually help soothe upset stomachs. It's kind of an anti-gas plant as well. So the next time, you have a little bit of upset stomach, you might want to try a few basil leaves, no problem there. It helps repel flies, believe it or not. So outdoors, keep on rubbing your hands through it, releasing that aroma. That really helps. The lemon basil, that can help repel mosquitoes as well. So that's something that's really nice to have on hand out on your porch or patio when you're out there. So that's really good. These plants, as long as the aroma has been released, they can be very good as far as deer and bunny resistance. It's really when you're not out there and you're not working with the basil, cutting the basil, releasing that aroma, that's when some of those larger pests can come in and eat it. And they will. They'll take the tops off of basil quite often. So just be aware that that's really how that works. If you're releasing the aroma, no problem. They will stay away from it. But if you haven't been out there and worked with it in a while, there's nothing to really repel those larger pests. So do keep that out there. Okay, let's talk about varieties really, really quick. And over here on my right-hand side, this is our favorite around here at Petitti's. This is Genovese basil. It is from Genoa, Italy. And I have to tell you that this basil has been gangbusters this growing season. We have cut it many, many times, cut into it, but it just keeps on branching. It's beautiful. It's a newer variety of Genovese basil. It has got some great disease resistance bred into it. So do look for this. We can't wait to make pesto out of this. We've been waiting and waiting and waiting for this video not to cut it, just to kind of show you how big and beautiful it is. So needless to say, it might get cut really, really soon so we can do some pesto out of it. Right next door, another Genovese here. This one down below is called Amethyst. It's a purple leaf basil. It is a sweet basil. It has a really good flavor, obviously very ornamental because of that purple. I will tell you early on, it's just starting to really come back. Early on, it had some fusarium problems. So it was not growing well this summer. It was just kind of too wet, too mild for it, and it's really just starting to come back nicely. So that's okay, but you'll see that with some basil sometimes. So amethyst, normally we have a regular growing season they do great, but this mild season just didn't really agree with it that well. And then there's African Blue planted on the side again. African Blue is one of the few basil varieties that does not get fusarium wilt. And so it really does a nice job growing in the garden. Again, very strong smelling. The foliage is much, it's not as glossy as some of the other basils, as most of the other basils. So it does have a different texture to it, but again, extremely aromatic. So keep that one in mind. I had the African Blue here that I deadheaded. This one, these two actually are both columnar basils. This is plain Greek columnar basil. It's a beautiful green color, nice deep green. It grew very well for us this summer, but I'm going to tell you, put your basils in deeper pots. They really do like the deeper pots. They don't necessarily like to be in the squat pots or smaller pots. They just kind of get leggy, and I think they do so much better if their root system can go deeper in the pot. So keep that in mind. But it did very nicely for us. And as I mentioned, Pesto Perpetuo, this is one of the few basils that doesn't really bloom, or I should say has very, very few blooms if it does. So you never really have to deadhead it. And this Greek columnar, we haven't had to deadhead or touch this whole season. So again, there's benefits to growing some of the columnar types where you just don't have to worry about the deadheading, and all the energy goes into the foliage production. So that's really, really nice to have. I think as far as basil, that's what we've got. Make sure that you're growing it in full sun. Make sure that it's warmer temperatures, so 50 to 80 degrees, okay? Make sure that soil is averagely moist to just slightly dry. Deep waterings, okay? Deeper, well-drained soil is also really beneficial for them. And keep that humidity up around them when they're indoors, and you're ready to go. Enjoy.